Welcome to UPThinking Finance, a podcast that offers a unique and discerning view of economics and financial planning. Here is your host, Emerson Fersch.
Welcome to another episode of UPThinking Finance. John F. Kennedy, in a speech at Harvard in 1956, said, "If more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, I am convinced the world would be a little better place in which to live." You know, one of the great things about the world we live in today, with all the problems and concerns and just uncertainty, is the fact that we have access to people that have opinions, that do research, that are thinkers, and we're getting a lot of different input. At least to me, it seems like I'm a lot more aware of differing views and new ways of looking at things than I was, say, 5 years ago. And so, the benefit of that as well, of course, is the fact that a lot of narratives are falling by the wayside. I mean, we talk a lot on this podcast about the financial industry and the narrative that people continue to cling on to. But there's other subjects like climate change. And, you know, I don't know where most people stand. I guess it seems like a nice idea. But the reality of it is everything's up for question. And so today's guest is one of those thinkers, one of those intellectuals. We share a mutual friend whose name will probably come up in our conversation. Her name is Cynthia Chung. Cynthia is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation and author of the book, The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set: The Birth of International Fascism and Anglo-American Foreign Policy. She's also the creator of a docuseries that we will be talking about in this discussion today, Escaping Calypso's Island, A Journey Out of Our Green Delusion. So it's my pleasure to welcome, coming to us from Montreal, Canada, Cynthia Chung. Cynthia, welcome to UPThinking Finance.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I thought a good place to start would be, just for anybody who's not familiar with you or your work, how you give us a little background and what brought you to the point of the Rising Tide Foundation.
There's obviously a longer story and a shorter story in terms of just like the practicality and the opportunity that was presented. It was through Strategic Culture Foundation that I started to actually write on a platform, and Zero Hedge at the time too was actually publishing a lot of the articles that were going up on from Strategic Culture Foundation onto their platform, as well as a lot of others. So that was like for me a real boost for having an access to a very large, diverse audience that I never would have thought was even possible, because my background is actually in molecular genetics.
Okay.
So I think it's kind of common nowadays for people to like find themselves in a position where they're doing something that they didn't plan out as like a young person going to school and everything. And I still, was a bit starry-eyed. And I believed that if I went to school like a good girl in university and everything, I could contribute to society in a way that, I could feel good about myself and also be excited to go to work and this sort of thing. And I began to realize, because I was a sort of a professional student, I changed my field of study several times, always within the sciences, but I was really struggling to find something that I felt comfortable spending the rest of my life basically doing as a career. But I always loved literature. I always loved the arts and things like this. And then increasingly, the way that the things were going in the world, I was getting more and more into politics. But when I was younger, when you don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong, except obviously there were problems with like hunger and poverty in other parts of the world and all this, but I was quite naive, and I didn't really understand anything about the politics of even like the country that I'm living in Canada or the United States, nothing. And it was very daunting for me to think like, where could I possibly even start to understand this? And ultimately that wasn't where I was passionate about. I was passionate about the arts and the sciences. So I started to, become more thoughtful of these things, and Matt, my husband, Matthew Erich, started to actually write for Strategic Culture Foundation. And what's very incredible is that normally their roster of writers, they're quite experienced in life, and they have a lot that they have as like a resume in terms of like being impressive. And for some reason, pretty much just me and Matt were, I think, allowed to come on and write for them. I know that there's a few writers since then that don't necessarily have like one of these more impressive resumes, but they just liked, the kind of writing that we were doing. And normally, you have to go through the whole, a whole bunch of like hoops that you have to jump through to usually get that kind of opportunity, especially nowadays. There's so many gatekeepers. So it was a really great opportunity. And that's where we ended up getting, I think, a lot of the audience that now follows us on Substack. But in terms of like the Rising Tide Foundation and all of this, there's a slightly, I guess, shorter explanation I can do. Is, again, because I was struggling when I was young to understand the world that I lived in and all this. I was very interested in philosophy and psychology. And I was, again, a naive teenager, and I would write on the internet like, hey, what are good books, Google, for me to be reading, good classical books that are good introductions to just, how do I think about the world sort of thing. And they were existentialist books, of course, that Google recommended. Whatever sites. I'm kind of joking it was Google, but it is because Google chooses, like what shows up first on your search engine. But they were all like painfully existentialist books. And, I'm a young person, so I read Albert Camus' The Stranger and Hemingway's Farewell to Arms and The Tropic of Cancer. And all of these books were, first of all, written by really jaded men who I think had a few problems with misogynism. But it was just like so bleak, their outlook in life. And I had to take a little bit of a break because I was like, oof, if that's like the world, I don't think I can handle it. And so I had to kind of take a long route because even in school, taking electives in the arts, even though I was in the sciences as my main thing, the arts were like the food for my soul. And I was always struggling to find something that would actually teach something in a way that I didn't feel like shit, basically, by the end of it. And so I eventually was able to get in contact with a way to study Plato. And this is actually with Matt, who's now my husband, through the LaRouche organization. I guess you could say it was like part of the curriculum that we got, into being encouraged to read things like Plato. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that it was really the LaRouche organization. It was more our reading group in Montreal in particular, and especially, I was lucky to be around someone like Matt, who was very thoughtful and was, basically the leader of the reading group. And, it was a really good process of like, getting an introduction of basically how to think and how to form hypotheses. And, it's not about, because school teaches you in a bad way to just memorize and have like the right answer. And there's a way to approach things where it's actually the question that matters more than the answer, in terms of like how you frame it, because it's going to frame your line of investigation and this sort of thing. And school teaches you to just try to have like a perfect answer, and then you just clamp it at that part. You don't move on and build upon that, branch, on your tree kind of thing. So that was for me a real game changer once I started to understand how that kind of process of thinking functions, which again, school doesn't teach you that at all. And then that was one of the things that basically, got us to start the Rising Tide Foundation, because it is a lot of crap to cut through. And even the libraries now, like, we have so many books. A lot of these books we actually got because libraries were like throwing out the books. And, a lot of these libraries are now purging, their what they have as collections because we need new books now, kind of thing. And, there's, I think, a bit of a crisis right now. There's a form of a book burning, I think, crisis that's going on in our society right now that people are totally unaware of, because we think that we can get any book that we want, but how do you know what book you need if you don't know what book you need, right? Like there's so many out in the world and this sort of thing. So at this point, it's like we don't have maybe such a clear censorship issue in our society, but it's more like information overload. So that there's so much information that you don't actually know where to go for like the right things. You don't need to spend, 10 years to know a subject. That's the other kind of bullshit that they say, that you have to be a specialist and then get another degree to specialize even further and specialize even further. So you can just talk about this little corner of a field of study, but at least you can feel really good about yourself. And now nobody can tell you, anything contrary because you're the boss of that little corner kind of thing.
And you've got 1 million letters after your name, right? Yeah. Just on the subject of books real quick, you're right. And, our mutual friend, Alex Craner, he got banned from Amazon, his trend following books. And then there was one he wrote that exposed some corruption. And, so you're right. You get 1 million choices, but you're not aware of the ones that have been removed. They just kind of disappear into the night.
And Alex has been so nice to offer his book for free, I think, for the most part at this point.
Okay, here's a question, and I hate to make it, but I was trying to think, okay, from because you write about a lot, and I'm going to be very honest, it's kind of embarrassing to admit, but a lot of, some of this stuff's just over my head. I mean, I really tried to dig in, and you've covered, like you just published an article about Frederick Douglass, and you asked some really good questions, penetrating questions. And so I was thinking, okay, you have this series on that we'll talk about in a little bit here, about, the energy wars and this whole, climate change, whatever. So I'm thinking, okay, is Cynthia a historian? Is she a crusader? Okay, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be offensive, but I'm saying, is there like where do you, how would you, if you're introducing yourself to somebody for the first time, how do you, or is that just part of the problem, trying to fit you in a box that really doesn't exist?
Yeah, I would say forever student. I mean, the thing that was actually really prevalent up until not that long ago, historically, was that you didn't have specializations like how we think of specializations nowadays. And it was very frequent that the best scientific minds that we know of, like a Leibniz, for instance, or, Brunelleschi, who built the Santa Maria del Fiore dome in Florence, that we still don't understand how he did it. Part of it is because back then they kept those things kind of secret too. There was a lot of politics involved, but these people were professionals in several different things. In the case of Leibniz, he was a lawyer as well as the person who invented calculus, and he was also a philosopher. He was a metaphysician. So, I mean, I think that again, with this approach to forming hypotheses, I tend to be pretty confident in anything that I want to ask questions about, that I want to understand, or that I feel that there's a lot of confusion or there's a lot of manipulation of information around. I have confidence in my own ability to look into it and not have to spend, an exorbitant amount of time looking into it to see a pattern or a paradox, where does the truth lie? And it's never obviously a full answer. I don't think you can ever have a full answer in everything that you're asking, but you can solve a lot. And I think that's one of the problems nowadays, is that people don't have confidence in what their mind can actually do. And a lot of people feel that they need to always ask an expert, what does this expert have to say, and this sort of thing. And obviously there are people who rightfully should be called experts, like a surgeon is going to have a certain amount of knowledge and experience that I won't be able to do by just reading a few books, or, an engineer, an astronaut, these sorts of things. But I can still understand philosophically, the domain of their career, so that, a surgeon might be arguing for, or I shouldn't say surgeon, let's say a doctor might be arguing that, oh, we need to put forward a medical policy of euthanasia because these are the practicalities right now in the medical system of what we can and we cannot do. Then at that point, you can, address those things without needing to be a doctor, in order to address those kinds of policy questions. So that's sort of what we're doing. Obviously, if the world were working differently, the first subject I chose for school was engineering, and I wanted to go into robotics for medicine, but also maybe not in medicine, but I wanted to go into robotics. And that's a field. I'm like 42, so that was like over 20 years ago that I wanted to do that in Canada. And it's still like not a field where you can hire that many people in robotics. Like we do have some things in Canada that we're doing, but it's like an incredibly small selective group, and they're not just Canadians that they're hiring to work in Canada. So it's ridiculous, that we don't have these kinds of opportunities to work in a lab. It's extremely hard for the average person. And usually as a scientist, if you're doing anything that amazing and you need the funding, you have to get your paycheck from the military industrial complex at this point.
Let me ask you this, because, it hadn't really occurred to me, but I mean, was there a point, because it sounds like, you strike me as a person with a soft heart who just wants to understand. And was there a point where, and I'm not painting you this way, but I'll speak for myself, and maybe jaded is too strong, but you started to realize that things just didn't make sense? Or was that just kind of, it sounds like maybe you came to that conclusion pretty early. Am I right on that or no?
Yes, I did come to that conclusion early, but I still felt like maybe it was my immediate surroundings that were disappointing. And if I were to do, excel in university and, first go to university and meet the minds that might be more serious, right, than what you're meeting in your community or high school or whatever, like the adults of the suburb that you're living in, that university would be a more serious thing. I think there's a reason why Harry Potter, these kinds of movies are popular, because it's nice to get excited over the fact that you could go to a place that has a wealth of knowledge and information, and that, it's a nice feeling, because as a young person, you're thinking my opportunities are endless as to what I can do. And you have a certain amount of confidence because you made it into this institution. It seems like, you'd have a bright future. But increasingly, when I was going through the system, I realized that no matter which way I turned, it was going to be controlled, and it was going to be a dead end. For me, when I was at my last year of my molecular genetics degree, I finally got to meet what the professors were actually doing, right? Because a lot of these professors were doing research on top of teaching, and you realized what they were doing. And it was like, oh, this one professor, her claim to fame is, discovering a few amino acid sequences in a DNA polymerase for, yeast. And I was like, I'm sorry, but I have bigger ambitions, and I don't have to necessarily discover something new, but I want to be a part of something bigger than just growing yeast in a petri dish over and over and over again, hoping to find 3 more amino acids in a sequence, or how does the DNA polymerase fold in a certain way, kind of thing. It was very soul killing, and it was very repetitive, right? That kind of laboratory work, when you're especially doing grunt work, it's very repetitive. It's really boring. And I had such a reality check. And then it's either you do that or you work for a pharmaceutical company. And I'm I never wanted to work for the pharmaceutical companies, because even though I was naive, I knew that was not going to be a good choice, as a scientist who wants to, do good things. So Yeah, it was when I graduated, I had my piece of paper, and it also looked ridiculous because the title was so long. But I didn't go to my graduation ceremony. Nothing. I felt like I just wasted 4 years of my life.
Let's talk about energy wars. I have to assume there's some symbolism in the escape from Calypso Island. I'm familiar a little bit with the story. Calypso, she kept as Odysseus, is that how you pronounce it, on an island for a period of time, tried to keep him there, and he longed for his wife after a certain amount of time, and eventually Zeus or somebody, let him free. I mean, I know that's the Cliff Notes version, but what's the symbolism of that? Can I ask?
I originally wanted to put that more of an explanation into the video series, but the reality was just that the technical limitations that we have with like AI, because the AI will work for certain things, and we tried to do a bit of a start with like the Odyssey involved in episode 2, and it was not working out with the AI. But the symbology is basically the Trojan War. It's commonly taught even in universities that like the Trojan War is sort of a curse. The Greeks entered a 10-year war that was not justified, and the way that the story goes is that Agamemnon, one of the Greeks, his brother Menelaus, that's his wife who Paris steals, Helen, and so it's a matter of like pride. A lot of it has to do with unnecessary pride. And Agamemnon, who's the brother and the chief of the Greek tribes, he, in one of the versions, sacrifices his daughter, Iphigenia, for good weather to sail to Troy. So it's already, very ominous. And so anyway, it's a 10-year war, and it completely bankrupts Greece. Like Greece doesn't benefit at all from this war, and it completely destroys Troy. Like by the end of it, all of the men are killed, and the women and the children are enslaved. So it's a very dishonorable war. And the story of Ulysses, who was on the Greek side, coming back from this dishonorable war, is his journey. The Odyssey is him what's a good word? I mean, redeeming himself, basically. And because they're cursed, a lot of them die, like trying to travel back from Troy to Greece, because they've cursed themselves. And Odysseus, or Ulysses is another version of his name, is the only survivor, and it's because he ended up surviving the trials that he went through. So that was the the kind of symbology behind this docuseries, because I think that we're also kind of headed in a direction where we could relate a lot to that, not just with like scientific policy, because the reality of scientific policy is that people do die from the policies that we put forward. Energy policy is a matter of, people dying if we make bad decisions on energy policy. That I think, especially in the West, we can sometimes very easily be disconnected from that. But it's not just that. It's like, I think that we're in a kind of existentialist point in the West right now where we kind of have to smarten up a little bit, or we're going to have some very serious. We already have serious consequences, but we're going to have like very, very serious consequences in the near future if we don't smarten up.
I've watched all 3 episodes, and I mean, gosh, I don't want to give away the some of this, because you get into a lot. And there's kind of a logical flow. You talk about your own sort of awakening, I think, if that's a fair way to put it, in terms of just the world around you. And, the thing that got me to reach out was I think it was in episode 3, and I mean, as a financial guy, the extent of my digging into the energy thing is really just a matter of, what's the impact on this green stuff on the stock prices and the futures contracts of, crude oil, natural gas, and whatever. I mean, it's pretty shallow. And when you have footage of women and little girls, putting together, cow pies, for lack of a better way to put it, shit. And that's their fuel. And I think you even asked this at one point, and I think you asked it in the Frederick Douglass essay you just wrote. Are we just the ones, me being born where I was in the life I have, and it hasn't been perfect, but the fact is I don't live in a situation where we're just in survival mode day after day after day. When did that become acceptable? That's an element. Where's the justice in that? Is that just they drew the short stick and that's their life? And I honestly, and I don't have any pride in this, but I never really connected this whole climate change thing. It's presented as, well, this is good for everybody. This is the future, and, oil bad, windmills good. And you don't, and the thing that's really awesome about this is you dig into the realities of stuff, and it's not an extremist, it's very matter of fact. And it's like, and so I don't even know where to begin, but I think you start off and you ask these three questions, which seems to be the foundation for, I guess, where, you've gotten to at least a couple of them. Is it possible to replace fossil fuel energy with non-carbon emitting renewable energy? Is renewable energy really environmentally friendly in its production, use of land and other resources, and waste disposal? And then how is climate crisis being defined? So I guess where I wanted to jump in, because again, I want, and we're going to be putting the website up, and it's risingtidefoundation.net, not .org. Make sure you go to the right one. The other one, anyway. But you brought up game theory, and I thought that was a really interesting episode too. And do you mind elaborating on a little bit on that? Because I guess you'll be helping me understand a little bit better, but there were some really good points in there. And I thought that was kind of an interesting to include in a discussion about, renewables and this whole climate change thing that everybody hears.
Yeah. Game theory, obviously influences pretty much all aspects of society at this point, politics, economics, military, and our philosophy, because I think that's where it's at the core. It's how we think about possibilities and how we think about solutions. At the end of the day, game theory has really, I think, narrowed or even limited our scope in a way that is not accurate to even reality at a certain point, because we really have like a certain kind of cynical blinders on, because we've been so ingrained with these things that are constantly repeated in the zeitgeist, which is zero sum, limited resources and this sort of thing. But when you actually look into, first of all, the United States legacy being an economic powerhouse, right there, you have something. How is it that the United States, as a very young country, within 100 years is doing the Centennial Exhibition? You're the leaders in scientific innovation. And the whole world, like countries that are much older than you, who have universities that are much older than you, and when you have good universities, it means you're also attracting typically the best minds in the world. And then the United States pops out of nowhere and is like the leader in all of these things. And a lot of it, first of all, the United States didn't just arise just like that. A lot of intelligent minds from like Germany came to the United States because they were actually being censored by the Congress of Vienna. It was like a huge attack on education and culture. That hit Germany very hard, but other countries in the area as well. And a lot of those people ended up going to the United States. So that's part of, I think, how that was able to happen. But it was basically a philosophical approach to economy that is what allowed the United States to successfully defeat empire. The United States story is the first story that, you had a successful victory against empire on all fronts, militarily, but also economically, because you had to have the economic victory as well. And it all stems from, how do you define the individual? Do you define the individual as a cattle or, a useless eater? Or do you define the individual as a source of wealth? But the American system, in the form of economics that succeeded and created it as the powerhouse it was, it viewed the individual as a creative resource. And the idea of credit as well, and long-term projects, these were things that propelled the United States forward in the world, such that you had countries like Germany organized its economic system off of the American system with the Zollverein. It was Friedrich List. You had, Russia that was also, really, studying what the United States had done. You had it in Japan. You even had it in China with Sun Yat-sen. You have, stamps with, Sun Yat-sen and the picture of Lincoln with the rails, and Sun Yat-sen actually studied in Hawaii. So you have all of these, things that were sparking based off of this recognition, through an economic system of the wealth of the individual. And that's totally counter to how we're taught nowadays with game theory. It's the complete antithesis of that. But you look at what was successful even in the past, if we want to have the hard facts. And it was that kind of approach that nowadays we're constantly told we can't do things because of budget constraints or whatnot, which is just a slow death if you were to ever, constantly adapt to what you have available. It's just going to shrink every year. You have to build and you have to invest into the future, including, projects that take time to build. So, game theory, gives us basically, in a very short summary, there's such a thing as win-win cooperation. So, if you're a country that is in a position where you have more economic wealth, it's still in your best interest to have your neighbors develop. And that was actually something, again, that the United States did have a policy, in the past. And we saw it with Kennedy, too, as one of the last presidents, I think, who was genuine about that, where it's in your best interest to do that because those countries will actually provide greater wealth in trade if they're more developed and not just a raw resource supplier. That's like one example of how game theory is not teaching even truthful realities. It's like true that we can all, at the end of the day, act like starved rats and, try to like, what was that movie, Purge, have like a week purge. Actually, Hitchcock did The Rope, which was also a bit of a, they were actually bringing that up as a joke even back then, strangle day or cut a throat day because there's just, too many people or whatever. But sure, we could adapt to that lower part in ourselves. I don't think, a lot of people would, but there would always be a disturbing number of people who would. Or we could, try to go in a direction that is something that is the better part of ourselves. You don't even have to be your best self. And I was actually talking to Mel K about this in terms of where most people are at. Even if you're a greedy person and you just want to make money, it's in your best interest to invest in something that's going to grow, not to tank and or to try to constantly keep other people down. It's in your best interest to have something that actually prospers if you even want more money. So at the end of the day, most people are not benefiting from these policies, and it's not about, it's national security. It's not about, there's not enough to go around. It's about, a system of empire, and that they want power in very few hands. And part of it is ideological. There isn't like a logic to it. It's not rational thinking from that standpoint. It's not logical thinking. And, I think that we saw, because I know that most people are not a fan of the World Economic Forum, neither am I. However, there are a lot of people who go to this forum because that's where you're going to network and you're going to, you're going to talk to a lot of people who are in fields that not like, I would say most people who go to that are not evil people. They're not ill-intentioned people. And then when the energy crisis hit Europe as a result of, there was already a crisis, right? And that's the thing too. People say, oh, COVID is the one that created the crisis with the supply chains and all this. There was already a crisis, but these things exacerbated it. And with the Ukraine war, when we had the energy crisis, it was really fun to watch the first World Economic Forum after the Ukraine war. So it was like about a year had gone by, and you could tell from the moderators that they were trying to keep the people like calm, because the people were clearly not having it, because basically the World Economic Forum was continuing to say absurd, insane things that people should do when it was clear that this was going to cause a lot more suffering, and even people who are just concerned about making money, that they were going to lose money going along with those kinds of policies. And so there was already like a lot of unrest amongst the people who were attending there. And you could tell because the moderators kept, addressing the audience. So you could feel the level of frenzy, basically. So I think that it's this is our nature. Human nature is to want to succeed and to prosper. And they tell you that you can't have everybody succeeding because it's a very old game of empire and feudalism to always pit people against other people when it doesn't have to be that way.
You had actually made a statement in the episode I thought was really good, which you talked about how everything that approach is operating in absolutes, and you just sort of said the same thing, in that what's not being accounted for are the qualitative elements, which is how people change and adapt and evolve. It's not factored into the equation, and that's really a big omission when you start trying to make all these declarations and all these policies. In fact, another one, and again, there's plenty of really good information and well-researched points that you bring up. In fact, I think you made the argument that you could fit the entire world's population in the state of Texas. Right? Wasn't that? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, with a townhouse. And like not even a two-story. You wouldn't need two-story. It's still one story.
Let me ask you this, and I'm not asking you to give away trade secrets, but or maybe you're just a researcher and it's just a skill. But I mean, I wanted to jump and cover a couple things in episode 3 real quick, and then gosh, the time goes by so quick. But how do you do your research? I mean, because you brought up a good point earlier, and this is the challenge. I'm one of those people. Full disclosure, I didn't wake up really until the COVID. And I've shared that story on this podcast before. So I didn't question stuff. Wasn't interested. Now it's like I question everything. I question every institution, the church I'm involved with, which that was another topic I was hoping we get to. Probably won't have time. But, how do you discern through all the BS? I mean, because it's almost like it's intentional to really keep people spinning their wheels.
There's no quick way to do that. I think that you have to, just like you have to go to the gym to work your muscles, you have to go to the gym to work your mental muscles. And so it's not about how much time you put into it or the quantity of reading you do. It's about quality, like you were bringing up, of the ideas that you're shaping and asking yourself. So it's a process, but because Matt and myself, we do research. Instead of just like listening to things, I can tell you that my learning is completely different when I'm in the orientation where I'm reading something because I expect to have to explain it, versus if I'm just reading it to try to understand something and I have no intention of like trying to put it into a construct to communicate to another person. As soon as I try to study something because I'm intending to teach it, it's on another level of receptivity and level of focus that I wouldn't have in that other mode. So that's really important. But as you also do a lot of research and things, you start to just see the patterns and things kind of make sense, because like you said, the COVID thing, and then you're starting to question everything, some people might think that you sound crazy. But the thing is that there was a huge amount of work and planning that went into that. And it means that there are a lot of things that were implicated in order to allow such a thing to come about, like the COVID lockdowns, right? And the amount of information control, or like how did they all of a sudden get the nurses and the doctors to believe something completely different than what they were believing up until that point, in terms of just even how do you deal with viruses? People were never taught that you can just wear a mask and that somehow protects you against viruses. You're supposed to wear the N95 masks that are fit to your face and that have like much smaller pores in them to protect you against things like tuberculosis, and things like that. The regular mask was always supposed to be just for droplet control. But then all of a sudden, all of the nurses and the doctors, they started to believe in these things. So, again, there's no quick answer, but people have to, basically spend a certain amount of time reading and thinking about things. I think that it's good, though, that so many people have kind of woken up, like you said, and they're going to hopefully pay a little bit closer attention. I think the only danger that we're in right now is that there are a lot of people who woke up recently and they're very angry and they want to just burn something down, right? They're looking for something to blame that they can just like totally annihilate, destroy kind of thing. And that's where the risk of radicalization and these sorts of things are happening. So that's a worry.
Well, it's obviously a lot of work, what you're talking about, but I mean, it's almost like it's mandatory at this point, putting in the time, without giving away, again, a lot of things that you talked about in episode 3. There's a question to this, but you compared I think the use of a typical refrigerator in the West, is about of consumption that I think 3 billion people have in certain countries a year. It's the equivalent. You talked about, some of the things that you basically dissected the fact that these renewables aren't, helpful for the environment. I mean, that's a real oversimplification of a lot of work, but I particularly enjoyed, you pointed out the amount of solar waste that's going to, exceed the actual amount of solar panels that are in place. You got into just how necessary fossil fuels are to even create the renewables, that you showed the mining that goes on, which, aside from the destruction of the planet and the environment, the amount of diesel fuel that's burned just mining for these minerals to help build these batteries for these cars. And I think, 10 to 20 tons of carbon dioxide before before you're out driving your electric vehicle. And so you really exposed the truth on all this. Was any of that surprising to you? Because I kind of had an idea, but to be truthful, it's actually even more disgusting than I thought.
The work that I did for this script, some of that work I had already done about a year ago, and then I built off of it to create the script for this episode. And yeah, I'm constantly like surprised too in terms of like how incredible the lies are. For justifying that, electric cars are somehow going to save the planet, sort of thing. Like, I didn't actually realize how much went into making one battery. It's a crazy amount of like mining to create one battery that you would need for an electric car. Or even like how Apple, can just buy a kind of, carbon-free, carbon-neutral branding, but it doesn't actually reflect anything on reality. It actually reminds me, oddly enough, of like back in the day, you could buy something in order for like, if you committed a sin, you could buy something.
You pay a tribute.
Yeah, I forgot. There's like a specific word that they had for it to like basically cancel your sin or like, kind of rid you of your sin. And I feel that we are dangerously like, in that kind of domain of insanity right now with like how we're managing things.
I got to bring this up because you struck a chord with something so I'm 60. And and, you know, I was in high school in the late 70s, early 80s. But you brought up something I had completely forgotten about. And it was the whole deal when I was in school was that we were going to have another ice age. And I'm thinking, I'm watching this. I'm like, oh my, I completely forgot. But it's like, what the hell happened? All of a sudden it's it's completely flipped. But I remember that was the script, right? And I laughed because it was like, oh my God, it brought me back to, I had forgotten.
Yeah. And even for like my generation, we were talked to about the ozone layer and acid rain.
Right.
And that acid rain was going to be like, just getting larger and larger, is going to be everywhere. And you don't hear about those things anymore. And now it's something different. But it's really terrible what they're doing to the younger generation. I went to Concordia just to visit the campus, and they actually had like this big clock that is just digital clock that's just counting down by millisecond how much time we have left on the earth. They have some random thing, of like, I forgot, like, 3,000 days or whatever. And they have like the milliseconds just constantly counting down towards this like end time. And that's like what these kids are like being taught in school.
Where's the hope in that? I mean, so gosh, anyway, I'm want to encourage everybody. I guess I'll put the link because this is a really well written, well produced docuseries. I really enjoy it. And I think the thing I don't want to forget to bring up, which again, I alluded to earlier, but was the suffering. That this green energy isn't making it any better for anybody else. The poor just get poor, and even another thing I wasn't aware of. I mean, I'm kind of all over the place, but these, the generator mafia over in Lebanon. I mean, the people, they get a certain amount of electricity allotted to them, but if they want more, they got to pay the few people who can afford to have a generator more money. And I think the thing of it is, and I sense that, and again, we've just had the first chance to meet, but I sense that, part of the motivation, I suppose, for you, I would think is just, and I get it, is why is it okay for people to live like this? Why is it particularly when you blow up all this BS of limited resource, which you do a great job of, and again, this is why people need to watch. But once you expose all that as a complete fallacy, then why? And I don't know if you know Charles Hugh Smith. Does that name ring a bell at all? He's over in Hawaii. I had a conversation with him a couple of times. Just another thinker, and kind of gets to the point that this path we're on is unsustainable. The totality of all of it. And but we talk about the fact that there's going to be a need for some pain, and because at some point you can't stretch the rubber band to where you got the 1% over here and everybody over here.
Alex Kreiner has also said that too. Yeah.
And so that's the thing, is at some point there's got to be some pain, because there's just certain, and again, then you show, pictures and you see the children, that this child, I mean, these are issues people are familiar with, but I think the thing that bothers me, and I'm as guilty as anybody, is, really not really embracing, not really digging into why is that okay? And I think that's where this is headed, is that we're all, you get back to, we're all connected, we're all part of, whatever your spiritual beliefs are, we're all part of some kind of energy source. And we're connected. And there's a responsibility there that I think a lot of just everything you brought up, we've been pulled away from, the humanity of it.
Yeah. And it's a model that's coming to us, like we are not getting stronger economically as first world countries. And, the problem with treating the rest of the world like that is that it eventually will come to nip you in the bud. Like, I think one important thing people should keep in mind is, like, for instance, the British Empire. You look at the kind of living standard that a lot of its British subjects, the people, had been put through, and it wasn't like they were living a great life, even though they were subjects of the greatest empire at that time. And that's how they view, like how the Irish were treated as well, or the Welsh, but even the British subjects, they don't they don't view you in terms of like favoritism that way. They view it as like there are people who are meant to have the power, you know, the 13 families in El Salvador who are just looking at like shanty towns. That's like their view. And they tell themselves, like one of them actually said in an interview, I just tell myself that they wouldn't know what to do with the money if they had it. Most people can't fit into that category of thinking, but the thing is that most of us are not excluded from that. I think again, COVID lockdown showed, what that was. What was the COVID lockdown? That was centralizing, like taking the money and putting it into fewer and fewer hands. That was one of the large things that was brought in from that. So it was a economic looting that was occurring. So we have to realize that we're in the same boat, and people who are brought down, it's not like, oh, this is another mouth to feed. This is another person to worry about. These are possible allies. These are possible resources that we can have. Like most of the world is now in a situation where they want to fight back. That's not a weak thing if you know how to handle that. That's a powerful thing that in some ways, because we're connected through the internet, we have like a level of connection that we haven't had before. And there are a lot of people who understand in one way or another, in a simplistic fashion, that the problem is more centralized, and it's like a nerve center, and that we don't have to go along with these policies, you know, as excuses of like budget reasons or whatnot. We have to be able to, you know, return back to a humane approach to things, and things are going to actually work out a lot better for us economically when we regain our humanity.
Gosh, that's probably a good place to stop. I love to end on a rising note of hope, but I have to ask you, just if you can't really, you know I really appreciate the time. It's just great to get to know you, Cynthia.
Oh, it's okay. No worries.
One last thing a little bit, and I know I mentioned this, I wanted to touch on, if you can, just to whet my appetite as well as everybody else's. You have an essay series on your Substack, which is Through a Glass Darkly, which that's got some biblical overtones. But it's about the shaping of a world religion. And I'm just kind of curious if you could, again, I know it's hard to take a big thing, but just the general idea behind it, because I think this is really interesting, and I think it's really important, because I think, quite frankly, religion and I honestly just, I mean, I don't know a nice way to put it. I think it's really actually separated people from the internal divinity that they have. And it's put a God out here that's right here, right now with the two of us inside our hearts. And, it's really separated people from who they are. So, okay, there I made my stand. But is that a fair question to kind of wrap it up?
Obviously, spirituality and the concept of sacredness, these are important things. And I think that over time, there's been a battle over, again, what could be simplified as a pro-human and an anti-human outlook, which has also existed within religion as a pro-human or anti-human outlook, right? Because religion has been abused. In this case, you could call it like either an anti-human religion versus a pro-human religion. And Christianity has, its struggles, as with other religions as well, have their struggles. Nothing has been perfect in this. Nothing is an emblem of like, hey, they've done everything right. Just like in a political system as well, right? Because at the end of the day, these are still very human, controlled institutions. In the case of this series, it's going to turn into a book. And I keep getting these other projects, so I haven't gone forward in it as much as I would like, but basically, it's basically just talking about how the concept of religion and spirituality, starting from the 19th century on, has been shaped in such a way that the counterculture movement was a totally predictable phenomenon that was also hand in hand with like the MK Ultra Tavistock stuff. A lot of people who went through the counterculture movement, they say, no, but it was good. And then the CIA came in, and then these other institutions came in, and then they mess it up. And what this series is going to go through is that this was something that was already being shaped in the way that it was in the 19th century. And it also has a role to play in how anthropology, the science of anthropology was started. And it's a very horrible story that basically had a direct hand in, genocide with the Native Americans. And the Smithsonian Institute and the sort of thing. So it's a massive project that, I still have a lot to do in terms of writing, but I know that my theory is solid. So I'm confident enough to announce it on your platform. And I've already done a certain amount of work on the counterculture movement and its connections with MKUltra, Esalen Institute as well. Like these are all, Esalen Institute is just a continuation of things that were happening in the 19th century. So that's the project.
Well, I appreciate you giving just sharing a little bit, because I just think your works is fascinating. And I really, you alluded to this earlier, you mentioned that it is one of the benefits of the world we live in now is the fact that, you're up in Canada, I'm down here in Southern Utah. We can have a conversation. I have a little stewardship or sphere of influence of people. And you just continue to share ideas, and all of a sudden, at a minimum, you realize you're not alone in your thoughts. But there is a hope in it. There really is a hope in it. And I just appreciate, that you've gone all in with your work and you followed your just the passion that you felt. Because a lot of people just seem like, and I don't mean to be judgmental, but I don't know. For me, if I were to die tomorrow, I don't have any regrets. I'm glad for where I am today. I feel like I'm doing what I can in my little area to try to help, and that's where you come in, is just sharing a new voice. And I just appreciate it. I really appreciate the time, and I really appreciate the work. And I just want to thank you, Cynthia, and your husband too. I know he's a big part of what you're doing, for joining me today on UpThinking Finance.
Well, thank you so much for that, Emerson. Hopefully we can, continue this conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Emerson Fersch is a registered representative with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisor services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from Capital Investment Advisors. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. The guest speakers and the companies they represent are not affiliated with or endorsed by LPL Financial or Capital Investment Advisors. Individual tax and legal matters should be discussed with your tax or legal expert. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. There is no assurance that the techniques and strategies discussed are suitable for all investors or will yield positive outcomes. The purchase of certain securities may be required to affect some of the strategies. Investing involves risks, including possible loss of principal.